All right, so let's look closely at the formal logical structure of the argument for God that uses the principle of sufficient reason. This is the second argument that you evaluated in your thought primer. And remember that for almost all of these arguments we're evaluating, the ideas are structured in such a way that if we regard all of the premises as true statements, to be logically consistent, we would also have to regard the conclusion as a true statement. Okay, so these premises ostensibly lead to the conclusion. If, though, we find reason for doubting any one or more of the premises, and think they may be false statements, then we don't have to accept the conclusion. So we want to evaluate each premise as it unfolds really carefully and ask ourselves, does that seem like a true statement? All right, so the first premise of this argument is this: something created is something contingent on its creator. That is, the created thing depends on a creator for its existence. Is that true? Seems true. That if something's been created, that implies there was something that brought it into its existence, right? Because it didn't exist before. Now it's been created and it exists. It seems like it would be dependent on that creator for bringing it into existence. So this seems like a true premise. Premise number 2 says a contingent thing cannot be its own cause. In other words, something can't create itself. Well, that seems true. Something could duplicate itself, perhaps. Something could replicate itself, but it would already have to exist to do that replication. Okay? So premise number 2 also seems true. Premise number 3, a contingent thing may or may not exist. It is finite, destructible, and not necessary. True? Seems like it. There was a point in time when I didn't exist. There's going to be, sadly, a point in time in which I don't exist again. So I'm finite. I don't have to exist. I didn't have to be brought into the world. Neither did you. We're both vulnerable. We can both be destroyed and our existence is eliminated. So premise number 3 also seems true. Premise number 4 says all the things in the world and the world itself are contingent. That is, we can imagine an alternative world in which the conditions are different and exclude the existence of any individual thing that exists in our world. Yeah, that's pretty easy to do, right? You think of science fiction movies where the physical laws are different, or the creatures are different, or their food is different. So none of the things that exist in our world, and in fact the world itself, they don't have to exist. They just happen to exist. They were caused to exist. They're contingent. Premise number 5, a necessary thing, though, not a contingent thing, a necessary thing does not depend on anything outside of itself for its existence, and nothing can prevent it from existing. Okay, so if it's a necessary thing ontologically, then that means we believe this thing couldn't not exist. It has always existed. It cannot be destroyed, so it will always exist. And it's because it's necessary, it's not contingent. It doesn't depend on anything for its existence. So it seems like if there is a such thing as a necessary thing, ontologically, that premise number 5 would be just definitionally true. Okay? So we've got 5 premises laid out in front of us, and they all seem to be true at this point. It doesn't seem like any of them could be false if we accept these definitions of contingent and necessary. Premise number 6 says, a necessary thing is uncaused, indestructible, self-sufficient, and independent. In other words, it doesn't depend on anything for its existence. It is necessary in the sense that there is no way for it to not exist. Okay, again, this seems definitionally true. If an unnecessary thing doesn't depend on anything for its existence, then that means that it wasn't caused. It wasn't brought into being by some other force or creator. So it's not contingent, so it's uncaused. If it's a necessary thing, that means it has to exist, so you can't destroy it. If it's a necessary thing, it means it's not dependent on anything, so it'd be self-sufficient and independent. So again, we have another premise that seems to be sort of definitionally true if we accept this idea that necessary things exist, contingent things exist, and ontologically impossible things don't exist. Premise number 7 says, God is the idea of a perfect being that has always been, that will always be, that is omnipotent, all-powerful, and omnipresent, everywhere at all times and all-knowing, and that is the source of all things. Well, again, definitionally, by the three major monotheistic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, that is what God is. Okay, so this is the definition of God according to monotheism. So again, we have another premise that seems to be just definitionally true. Premise number 8, there can be only one necessary thing in the universe. Okay, let's think about that. Is that true? Could there be only one necessary thing in the universe? Again, it seems that we can deduce that to be true. This statement has to be true, because if there were two necessary things in the universe, then they would each be depending on one another for their identities. We'd have to say, what is the difference between this necessary thing and this necessary thing? And we'd have to say, well, this one is not like that one, or this one is not that one. And now all of a sudden, its identity becomes dependent on the other necessary thing. And we know by definition, a necessary thing has no dependency on anything. So again, premise 8 seems to be, by the concept of necessary ontological thing, this seems to be like a true premise. Premise number 9 says, the source of all things cannot be a contingent thing. The source of all things cannot be a contingent thing. Well, again, that would seem to be logically required, right? Because if the source of all things was a contingent thing, then that would imply that there was something that existed before that source of all things that was not contingent. And if it was, there would have to be something behind that created that contingent thing that was non-contingent. So eventually we get to the point, retreating back into this regression here, where we have to come to an uncaused, necessarily existing thing that then set into motion some sequence of events that caused all the other things to exist. So again, premise 9 seems to be definitionally true. Premise 10, the world is contingent on a necessary thing. Yes, because if premise 9 is true, and it is, if in fact necessary things exist, then at some point in the regression of contingent things that exist and events that have occurred, you're going to come up on the original cause of all things, the uncaused cause. That will be the necessary thing. So premise 10 seems to be true. Premise 11, God is the necessary thing, being on which the existence of the world depends. If we accept that necessary things exist, then the conclusion seems to follow from these premises. All right. So now what we would want to do is we're looking at these premises, and if we accept all of them as true, that conclusion necessarily follows. And we seem to have proven that there is some uncaused cause that is the source of all things that exist, unless we can find a problem with the premises or any one of the premises. And I would submit to you that those two statements are problematic. And by problematic, I don't mean they're untrue. I just mean that we're stuck back at this point where we have to make a decision about what seems more plausible. That everything that exists has always existed. It's never not existed. And there's just been this series of events and things being caused to exist in this sequence of events that goes back into infinity. Or that the world actually is contingent on a necessary thing. There is some uncaused cause that exists at the beginning of all things that exist. And so we're kind of stuck again in this position where we have to pick one. Which one seems to make more sense? Does it make sense? Can it make sense that there can be an infinite regression of causes, an infinite regression of events that have just always been taking place and that never had a starting point? And there are some that are going to argue that doesn't seem to make sense, because my observation is that everything that exists was caused to exist by something that came before it. And if you retreat back into infinity, you're never going to get to the first cause of anything. You'll just keep going because it's infinity. And that implies that all the stuff that exists has always existed. And I'm stuck with this question, well, what caused the stuff to exist? Okay, so again, we're sort of stuck in this point where we have to make a leap of faith. What makes more sense? God created all the stuff and set things in motion, or things have always just been in motion? You have to make that decision, which one seems more plausible to you.